The first clue that something big just snapped in Washington wasn't a speech. It was a vote count. A handful of lawmakers, some of them normally reliable votes for the president, walked into the House chamber knowing two things at once. The politics would be ugly and the economics could get worse. When the clerk read the final tally, it landed like a warning flare, not because one resolution can instantly end a trade fight, but because it publicly mapped the fracture line inside the governing party. For years, tariffs have been sold as a clean weapon. Hit a rival, bring them to the table, declare victory. But that story only works if the damage stays on the other side of the border. When the costs ricochet back into American factories, farms, and gas stations, tariffs stop looking like strength and start looking like a self-inflicted wound. This week, the U.S. House moved to strike at the legal foundation of President Donald Trump's Canada tariffs. Lawmakers passed a joint resolution designed to terminate the national emergency the administration used to justify those tariffs. The vote 219 to 211, with 6 Republicans joining nearly all Democrats. On paper, it's procedure. In reality, it's a signal that the center of gravity is shifting from loyalty to liability. Tonight, we're going to reconstruct what's actually happening. The legal architecture that lets a president move fast on trade, the timeline that pushed Congress to act, the Canadian counterplay that turned American domestic politics into Ottawa's leverage, and the reason your household, whether you live near the border or 1,000 miles away, can feel tariff shocks faster than you think. And we're going to do it carefully, with verified facts and clear lines between what lawmakers have done, what they can do next, and what the White House is likely to attempt in response. Because under the noise is the real investigative story. When a modern trade war starts, it doesn't spread like a debate. It spreads like a supply chain outage, quietly, mechanically, and then all at once. To understand why this feels like a rebellion, you have to start with the toolkit and the incentives. The Constitution gives Congress the core power over tariffs, but Congress has repeatedly delegated authorities to presidents so they can respond quickly to security threats, economic shocks, and international crises. Those delegations created a pattern. Presidents act first, lawmakers react later, often when the bill comes due at home. In today's trade fights, 3 legal lanes matter, and they often get blended in public debate. Lane 1 is Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the National Security Tariff Lane. If the executive branch determines that certain imports threaten national security, it can impose tariffs or quotas. The controversy is not that the statute exists. It's how elastic national security can become when interpreted broadly. The Congressional Research Service has documented recurring congressional interest in narrowing or reforming the mechanism. Lane 2 is emergency power. Declare a national emergency, then use other statutes to restrict trade or financial flows. In this Canada dispute, critics argue the emergency logic is being used as a shortcut to impose sweeping economic penalties. That critique has made its way into the framing of the House action, which targets the emergency itself rather than negotiating the tariff rate like a tax bill. Lane 3 is the practical lane, administrative control. Even when tariffs are blocked or delayed, agencies can change how trade feels at the border through inspection intensity, paperwork demands, enforcement surges, and regulatory friction. That lane rarely gets the headlines, but it can disrupt commerce almost as effectively as a tariff, especially on tightly timed manufacturing lines. Now, the timeline that drove the House vote. When Reuters covered the House action on February 11, 2026, it described the vote as a rare rebuke to Trump in a chamber where Republicans hold only a slim majority. It also underlined the math that makes this a struggle, not a finale. To overcome an expected presidential veto, Congress would need 2/3 majorities in both chambers. 2 days later, policy analysts were warning that even a symbolic vote can change behavior. Why? Because corporations and state officials treat congressional signals like weather reports. A single vote can shift expectations, unlock lobbying budgets, and make risk committees reprice contracts. But let's separate fact from the viral narrative. Some online scripts describe a dramatic, overwhelming Senate vote that instantly stripped the president of tariff authority over Canada. That's not supported by the public record we can verify. What we do have are earlier Senate votes moving to end the Canada emergency on much tighter margins. Important because they show bipartisan concern, but not the kind of veto-proof stampede suggested in some commentary. In one reported Senate vote, the measure passed 50-46, with a small number of Republicans joining Democrats. And we also have evidence of broader Senate discomfort with expansive tariff authority. Trade groups and industry organizations have tracked multiple Senate resolutions aimed at limiting the president's tariff powers, reflecting an ongoing debate about whether Congress ceded too much discretion to the executive. So why did the House move anyway? Because the costs are legible in local terms, and local terms are what break party discipline. Think of the U.S.-Canada economic relationship less like two countries trading and more like a single industrial system with a border running through the middle. That system has three features that make tariffs politically dangerous. First, speed. Supply chains are scheduled in hours and days, not months. A tariff announcement can trigger immediate inventory moves, price adjustments, and production planning changes. Second, repetition. Goods, especially auto components, can cross the border multiple times during the same production cycle. A tariff that appears modest on paper can compound through repeated crossings. Third, concentration. The pain is not evenly distributed. It lands hardest in specific regions, manufacturing corridors, farm states, border states, and energy-sensitive markets. That's why governors and senators get pulled into this quickly. They don't have to predict the whole national economy. They just have to predict what happens to their largest employer, their largest exporter, or their most politically sensitive consumer prices. Now, enter Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Whether you agree with his politics or not, the point for this story is strategic. Carney is treating this as a structural relationship problem, not a public argument problem. On February 16, 2026, he announced a new chief trade negotiator for the United States, Janice Charette, positioning Canada for the scheduled CUSMA review by July 1st. That appointment is not theater. It's a signal that Ottawa expects friction and wants professional depth at the table. Carney's government is also signaling diversification. Reuters reported that Carney is planning a visit to India in early March to work on a framework for a comprehensive economic partnership with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, part of a strategy to expand Canada's trade partnerships beyond the U.S. In other words, Canada is building an exit ramp even if it never takes it. And the existence of an exit ramp changes bargaining power. But Canada's most effective leverage isn't only overseas, it's inside the United States. Here's the investigative pivot. In a hyper-integrated economy, the target of a tariff is not only the foreign exporter. The target is also the domestic importer, the domestic manufacturer who needs inputs, and the domestic consumer who pays the final price. That reality lets a foreign government influence U.S. policy by influencing U.S. stakeholders, legally, publicly, and with data. You can see the outlines of that strategy and how this story has unfolded in public reporting. Pressure moves toward lawmakers, not just the White House. Messaging is framed around jobs and prices, not national pride. The timeline is designed to make costs feel imminent, not theoretical. Even the symbolic fights matter. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, Windsor to Detroit, should be a celebration of cross-border integration. Instead, it became part of the tension. The Guardian reported Trump threatening to block its opening, while Carney pushed back by emphasizing that Canada funded the bridge and that the project is a shared effort with U.S. labor and materials. Why bring up a bridge in a tariff fight? Because bridges are visual. And in politics, what's visual becomes memorable. A tariff is a spreadsheet. A bridge is a picture. Turning integration into an image makes it harder to dismiss as just trade. Now let's talk about the numbers that drive lawmakers toward revolt. When tariffs rise on a major trading partner, three categories of costs tend to spike first. Energy and fuel. Canada is a significant supplier of energy products into U.S. markets. Any disruption, tariff-driven or administrative, can feed quickly into regional price swings, especially where pipelines and refineries are tuned to Canadian supply. Autos and manufacturing North American auto supply chains are designed around cross-border flow. Even small delays or cost changes can force plants to idle because a modern assembly line is a timed choreography. If one critical component is missing, the whole line stops. Housing inputs and consumer goods. Lumber, metals, and intermediate goods move heavily across the border. Tariffs on inputs can show up downstream as higher construction costs and higher retail prices. This is why the House vote, even if it fails in the end, can be rational for lawmakers. They can point to it later as evidence they tried to stop a cost surge. In politics, being able to say, "I voted to prevent this," can matter almost as much as actually preventing it, especially when the president holds the veto. But the deeper issue is institutional. Congress is trying to remind the country that trade policy is not supposed to be improvisation. It's supposed to be governance. And that's where the internal Republican dilemma sharpens. A party that often celebrates executive strength is now confronting the downside of executive discretion. When tariffs are imposed quickly, the political blast radius can hit home before lawmakers have time to build an alternative story. The House resolution also intersects with a broader debate about emergency powers. The Cato Institute, reacting to the vote, argued that even if the resolution doesn't stop tariffs immediately, it highlights how many national emergencies are active and how they can unlock broad presidential powers, an argument that resonates with civil libertarians on the left and limited government conservatives on the right. So what specifically does the House vote do? It does three things at once. It creates a public record that bipartisan resistance exists. It creates a procedural pathway for the Senate to act, or at least to be forced to explain why it won't. And it strengthens the negotiating position of every domestic actor who wants tariffs eased. Businesses can now say, Congress is moving. This isn't just us whining. That's why the vote feels like a revolt, even if it's not yet a victory. It's not the end of the story. It's the moment the story switches genres, from a presidential threat to a constitutional fight. Add the missing human layer, how the pressure campaign actually works. When tariffs become imminent, the first people to mobilize are not diplomats. They're compliance officers, logistics managers, and procurement teams. They run scenario models. If the duty hits on Tuesday, how many days of inventory do we have? Which supplier can substitute? How much does substitution cost? Which plant becomes the bottleneck? Those models then become memos. The memos become calls. The calls become political heat. In Washington, that heat usually follows a predictable path. Step 1. Industries with immediate exposure. Automakers, energy traders, manufacturers that import intermediate parts begin contacting their trade associations. The trade associations contact congressional staff. Staff contact members. Members contact leadership. Leadership contacts the White House. It sounds orderly, but it's rarely centralized. It's parallel panic. Step 2, state officials enter. Governors don't have tariff authority, but they do have labor markets. When a governor hears that a plant might idle or that a key commodity price could jump, they don't wait for an academic paper. They call senators. And senators pay attention because governors are the first responders to economic pain. Step 3, members start demanding off-ramps. Sometimes that means exemptions. Sometimes it means delaying implementation. Sometimes it means pushing for an alternate negotiating channel so the president can claim progress without detonating supply chains. Canada's advantage in this system is that it can anticipate which domestic actors will feel the hit first. That's not espionage. It's economics. Trade data is public. Industrial geography is public. The political map is public. A sophisticated team can overlay all three and estimate where a tariff shock becomes a political shock. This is why, even without access to private briefings, you can see Canadian strategy in the public record. Targeted messaging, repeated emphasis on jobs and prices, and an insistence that the relationship is mutually beneficial. Ottawa is trying to make the cost of escalation feel local to the United States. Now zoom in on the law again, because the mechanics shape the battlefield. A joint resolution to terminate an emergency is a creature of statute, not a constitutional magic wand. Under U.S. law governing emergencies, Congress can attempt to end a declared emergency, but the president can veto that attempt, and overriding the veto requires supermajorities. That design reflects a tension. Congress wanted a way to constrain emergency declarations, but presidents wanted the ability to act decisively. The result is a political chessboard. The House vote doesn't flip a switch. It forces everyone to reveal their position. It forces Senate leadership to decide whether they will schedule a vote. It forces senators to decide whether they will risk a recorded stance. It forces the White House to decide whether to escalate, negotiate, or litigate. And it forces markets to decide whether the next move is stability or chaos. This is also why the fight spills beyond tariffs themselves. If a president senses Congress is trying to reclaim power, the president often responds by shifting venues toward executive discretion and away from legislative votes. That brings us back to the border friction lane. For border communities, friction isn't abstract. It means longer truck lines, delayed deliveries, missed shifts, and spoiled perishable goods. Those effects don't always make national news, but they create intense local pressure, pressure that can flip the position of a member who otherwise likes the politics of tough talk. And there's another underreported piece: currency and finance. Trade conflict tends to strengthen or weaken currencies based on expectations of growth and inflation. When investors think tariffs will raise costs and slow production, they adjust. Those adjustments can amplify price movements at home. A tariff can raise inflation directly through import prices. It can also raise inflation indirectly through currency shifts and uncertainty premia. That's why markets often react to the threat of tariffs even before a single container clears customs. Now put those mechanics into the context of Trump's style. Trump's tariff politics are built for attention. Announce a big number, force a response, dominate the cycle. But attention politics collide with supply chains because supply chains are built for reliability. When reliability is threatened, the business community doesn't negotiate in public. It negotiates by moving money and moving votes. That's where Carney's profile matters. Carney is widely described in public reporting as a leader focused on economic systems, trade diversification, and institutional preparation. The appointment of a senior negotiator and the emphasis on upcoming CUSMA review timelines are not random. They are part of a broader stance. Make the relationship procedural, not personal. The bridge dispute fits that frame too. A bridge opening date should be a ribbon cutting. In a politicized trade climate, it becomes a pressure point. The Guardian report captured the tone. Threats, rebuttals, and a struggle to keep cross-border infrastructure from becoming a political pawn. Now, let's widen the lens to global context, because Washington doesn't fight trade wars in a vacuum. Every time the U.S. escalates with a close ally, other partners recalibrate. Some hedge, some accelerate regional agreements. Some move critical supply chains away from U.S. exposure. The effect is slow but cumulative. The more unpredictable U.S. trade policy appears, the more incentive other countries have to build redundancy. That's why Canada's India outreach is so telling. It's not that Canada can replace the U.S. market overnight. It can't. It's that Canada is signaling it will not be cornered into a single exit. When Reuters reports a high-level visit designed to expand trade frameworks, that's the language of hedging, building options so threats lose potency. Finally, bring it back to the House vote, because the vote is the public face of a deeper fight. The House did not just vote on Canada. It voted on the idea that emergency powers should not become a default trade instrument. Whether the resolution survives or not, it has already changed the incentives. It invites more challenges, more oversight proposals, and more bipartisan coalitions built around limiting discretionary tariff power. That is why this week matters. It's not only a clash of leaders, it's an inflection point in who gets to steer the American economy when the steering wheel is labeled emergency. And the July 1st CUSMA review marker is more than a date on paper. It is a countdown clock for investors. Companies negotiating multi-year supplier contracts need to know whether rules of origin, dispute panels, and tariff safeguards will hold. If they don't know, they build contingency plans, often by shifting investment away from North America. That's the quiet cost of political volatility, factories that never get built. When that happens, no speech can bring the jobs back overnight. Now, the impact and the future outlook. Why this matters is bigger than one president and one neighbor. It's about the credibility of the American economic system. Global commerce depends on predictability, not perfection, predictability. Companies can survive bad rules if the rules are stable. They struggle under shifting rules because shifting rules turn planning into gambling. When tariffs are tied to emergency declarations or broad national security claims, allies begin to question whether agreements are durable. Canada, for example, relies heavily on the U.S. market. Roughly 70% of Canadian exports go to the United States, and CUSMA is a shield as much as it is a contract. That's why Carney's government is staffing up for the review and treating it as existential. But the United States is also exposed. Interdependence cuts both ways. If a tariff makes a Canadian exporter suffer, it can also make an American manufacturer stumble. That mutual vulnerability means the strongest player isn't always the one with the loudest threats. It's the one that can mobilize the other side's internal constraints. Canada's strategy, so far, appears to be exactly that. Activate the constraints. The immediate near-term consequences will be felt in three arenas. Arena 1, business behavior. Even before any new tariffs take effect, uncertainty triggers precaution. Importers rush shipments. Manufacturers build buffer inventory. Retailers adjust pricing assumptions. Those moves are invisible until the moment you notice a price jump or a product shortage. Arena 2, domestic U.S. politics. This fight forces Republicans to pick which identity dominates, the party of Trump or the party of business stability. Some will try to avoid the choice by calling the House vote symbolic. But symbolism is sometimes the first step toward a caucus split. Arena 3, diplomacy. When Canada begins building trade partnerships beyond the United States, like the India outreach Reuters described, it isn't just economic planning, it's leverage signaling. If Ottawa can credibly say we have other routes, Washington's pressure loses bite. So what could happen next? 4 plausible paths, each with different consequences. Path 1, escalation through friction. If the White House can't keep a tariff in place legally or politically, it may lean on the border itself. More inspections, slower clearances, tighter enforcement. The effect is similar. Higher costs, delayed parts, political pain. The difference is accountability. It's harder to point to a single tariff rate when the pain comes from time lost at crossings. Path 2, legislative attrition. The House has moved. The Senate may or may not follow quickly. Leadership can slow walk, amend, or bury a resolution without killing it outright, especially if senators fear retaliation. But every delay keeps the issue alive and keeps pressure on senators from home state industries. Path 3, legal relabeling. If one emergency declaration is terminated, the White House could attempt to reframe the rationale under a different statute or a new declaration. That triggers litigation, and litigation triggers uncertainty. Markets tend to punish uncertainty because it freezes investment decisions. Path 4, negotiated reset. The president can declare he won something. Canada can concede a face-saving procedural change, and both sides step back from the cliff. This is the most economically stable outcome. It's also politically delicate. It requires each side to sell a retreat as a win. Now the longer horizon. The scheduled CUSMA review date, July 1st, hangs over all of this like a deadline. Canada is preparing for it, as shown by Carney's appointment of a chief negotiator. The United States, meanwhile, is demonstrating that even within a single administration, trade policy can become a moving target. That combination, review deadline plus policy volatility, creates a powerful incentive for Canada to keep diversifying. If Ottawa can reduce its dependency even a little, it reduces the leverage that any U.S. president can wield in a future crisis. But the story is also a mirror held up to Washington. Congress is rediscovering a muscle it let weaken: oversight of trade and emergency power. The House resolution doesn't guarantee the tariffs end. What it guarantees is that the conflict is now about institutional authority as much as it is about policy preference. And that's why the ending of this story won't be written by one man at a podium. It will be written by processes, Senate schedules, court filings, agency directives, corporate plans, and voter anger when prices move. So here is the conclusion, grounded in what we can prove today. A bipartisan slice of the House has publicly challenged the emergency basis for Trump's Canada tariffs. The Senate has shown, at least in earlier votes, that this is not a strictly partisan issue. Canada, under Mark Carney, is staffing up for a consequential trade review and signaling a broader diversification strategy. That's the structure. And the meaning of the structure is this: in an integrated economy, coercion doesn't just travel outward, it rebounds. When it rebounds hard enough, it forces even loyal allies to choose between political allegiance and economic survival. This week's vote didn't end a trade war. It revealed the limits of one, and it reminded Washington that the loudest weapon is rarely the strongest. The strongest is the one that can't be ignored by the people who have to live with the consequences.